Have you ever poured your entire soul into something, only to realize you were just a placeholder? I learned that lesson on a Friday night in October, somewhere between a complaint about oversalted prosciutto and a delivery of wilted artichokes. The air in Russo's trattoria was thick with the scent of garlic, basil, and the low-grade panic that fuels any successful dinner rush. It was a symphony of chaos, and for the last 10 years I had been its conductor. The controlled madness of it all was a testament to my work. Amelia, Mr. Henderson at table 4 says the prosciutto is too salty to be edible. The words came from Maria, our newest waitress, her eyes wide with terror as if she'd personally offended the man. I gave her a reassuring smile. I knew what this was about. Don't worry. He does this every third visit. Tell him I'm coming over and that I'm bringing him a glass of the Valpolicella he loves, on the house. It wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about knowing that Mr. Henderson's wife always made him stick to his diet, and a free glass of wine was his little victory. This was the dance I'd perfected. While the wine was being poured, my phone buzzed. It was our produce supplier. I stepped into the cramped back office, the din of the dining room replaced by the hum of the ice machine. What do you mean the artichokes are all you have? Tony, they look like they've been through a war. No, I'm not going to just trim them. My chef Luca would hang me with his apron. I kept my voice low but firm. This was the part of the job my father never wanted. He was the charm, the face. I was the spine. After 5 minutes of negotiation, a fresh case of artichokes would be here in an hour, and we'd get a 10% discount on our next invoice. Another fire put out. Back on the floor, I saw Maria struggling with the point-of-sale system, her fingers fumbling on the touchscreen. I walked over and gently guided her hand. You're trying to split the check before you send the order. You have to send the entrees to the kitchen first, see? Then you can go into table management and create separate tickets. This system was my baby. I'd spent months researching it, fighting my father on the cost, and implementing it myself. It had cut our ticket times by 7 minutes and virtually eliminated kitchen errors. It was one of the key reasons we were still in business, but to my father, it was just the computer thingy. As the last dessert plates were cleared and the final espressos were sipped, the chaos finally subsided, leaving behind the pleasant hum of satisfied customers and clinking glasses. I found my father, Marco, at the end of the bar, polishing a wine glass with a soft cloth. He watched me with a look of immense pride, the kind that both warmed me and broke my heart a little. He was 62, his face a roadmap of long hours and loud laughter, a man who built this place with his hands but had long since forgotten how the engine actually ran. He saw the finished painting, not the brush strokes. He waited until I sat on the stool beside him, the exhaustion finally settling into my bones. The scent of spilled wine and old wood was the smell of my entire life. He put a heavy hand on my shoulder, his eyes gleaming. You see, Amelia? This is what a real restaurant looks like. You handle it so well. Such a good girl. I smiled, a genuine but tired smile. For a moment, I felt seen. For a moment, the 10 years of 60-hour weeks, the missed weddings, the non-existent personal life, it all felt worth it. Then he delivered the line that changed everything. He leaned in closer, his voice filled with a giddy, conspiratorial excitement. It was the same tone he used when he'd secured a rare shipment of white truffles. Just you wait. When Leo gets back with that MBA of his, when he's finally home, then we're really going to fly. We'll be a true business empire. He beamed, looking past me, his eyes fixed on a brilliant future. I kept the smile plastered on my face, but inside, a sudden sharp cold spread through my chest. An empire, he'd said. But in his vision of the future, I wasn't the one on the throne. I was just the one keeping it polished for the rightful heir. What's the difference between a brilliant idea and a beautiful, expensive mistake? Sometimes you're the only one in the room who can see it. The Sunday dinner for Leo's return felt less like a celebration and more like the unveiling of a new religion. The entire Russo clan was crammed into my parents' dining room, the air rich with the scent of Luca's 8-hour osso buco. At the head of the table sat my brother, Leo, 28 years old and glowing with the kind of confidence only a fresh MBA and zero real-world failures can bestow. He was the prodigal son, and everyone was ready to worship. He spoke a language I understood from textbooks, but that he wielded like a weapon. It was all about synergy and leveraging our core assets to achieve market penetration. My aunts and uncles, who wouldn't know a core asset if it hit them in the face, nodded along, mesmerized. My father, Marco, was practically levitating with pride. I watched him, this charismatic stranger in my brother's body, and felt a cold dread creep up my spine. He was describing a business, but it wasn't the one I had spent the last decade saving from the brink of bankruptcy. This was a theoretical company that existed only in his PowerPoint presentations. First, we disrupt the traditional Italian-American space, Leo announced, using a fork to draw an imaginary graph on the tablecloth. We pivot to a high-concept menu. Think deconstructed carbonara, saffron foam, spherical olive oil. It's not just dinner, it's an experience. We become a destination. I pictured Luca, our 58-year-old chef who still kissed his fingertips after tasting a perfect sauce, being asked to create a Parmesan air. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing or maybe screaming. Leo, the equipment alone for something like that is... I started but was cut off. Details, Amelia. We can't get bogged down in details, my father boomed, waving a dismissive hand. Let him speak. This is vision. Leo smiled graciously, as if forgiving my small-minded interruption. Phase 2. We launch a direct-to-consumer product line, the Russo recipe. Frozen pastas, jarred sauces. We build brand identity beyond the brick and mortar. I tried again, my voice quieter this time. The logistics of food production and distribution are incredibly complex. We'd need a dedicated facility, quality control. It could dilute the brand if not done perfectly. My words evaporated before they reached my father's ears. He was too busy looking at his son as if he'd just turned water into wine. Then came the final devastating blow. And that's how we scale, Leo concluded, leaning back in his chair, the undisputed king of his imaginary empire. Franchising. A Russo's Trattoria in Boston, in Chicago, in D.C., a standardized, replicable model of excellence. That was it. That was the moment I realized he wasn't just naive, he was dangerous. He wanted to take the one thing that made us special, the history, the soul, the fact that I knew our customers by name, and turn it into a sterile cookie-cutter chain. He was selling a myth, and my family was buying every word. The room erupted in applause. My mother was dabbing her eyes with a napkin. My father stood up and pulled Leo into a fierce hug, his voice thick with emotion. This is the future of the Russo name. He looked at Leo, then his gaze swept over the rest of the family, landing on me for a fleeting second with an expression that said it all. You've been a wonderful caretaker, it said. Thank you for keeping the throne warm. But the real king has returned. I just sat there, a ghost at the feast, pushing a piece of perfect non-deconstructed meat around my plate, tasting nothing but ashes. Have you ever tried to cash a check that was written in disappearing ink? The promise is there. You can see the faint outline of the letters, but the value is gone. It had been 2 days since Leo's triumphant return, 2 days of his business jargon echoing in my head. I decided the time for waiting was over. On Tuesday morning, before the produce deliveries started, Before the day's chaos could be used as an excuse, I found my father in the small, cluttered office that was more my domain than his. The room smelled of old paper, espresso, and the lemon cleaner I used on the desk every night. He was hunched over the previous week's receipts, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up and smiled when I came in. "Ah, Amelia. Good. You're here. I want to look at the numbers for the wine order. I think with Leo's ideas, we should be investing in a more ambitious cellar." It was the perfect opening. I closed the door quietly behind me, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I had rehearsed this conversation 100 times, and yet my throat felt tight. "Actually, Papa, I wanted to talk about something else." I took a deep breath, anchoring myself. "I was thinking about a few years ago. Do you remember when the old accounting software crashed and we almost lost a whole quarter's worth of records? Or when our first chef quit with no notice, and I cooked on the line with Luca for 2 weeks?" He chuckled, taking off his glasses. "Of course I remember. You were a lifesaver. You always have been." The praise felt like a pat on the head, but I pressed on. "You made me a promise then. You said that the day I got this restaurant out of debt and running profitably, you would make me your full partner. An official, legal partner." There it was. The words were out, hanging in the cramped space between us, more solid than the stacks of invoices. His smile didn't vanish, but it tightened at the edges. He leaned back in his chair, a familiar gesture he used when he was buying himself time. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the wine fridge. I could see the gears turning in his head, searching for the right path, the one that would cause the least amount of friction. He was a master of managing people's feelings, a skill that had built his restaurant's loyal following and, I was beginning to realize, had kept me in my place for a decade. "Amelia, mia cara. What's this all of a sudden?" he said, his voice a soft, placating murmur. "Of course, that's the plan. It has always been the plan." The relief that flooded me was so intense it almost made me dizzy, but it was followed by a wave of cold caution. The words were right, but the tone was off. "It's just, now is a very exciting time. Leo is back. He's full of energy. We have to think about the future, get all our ducks in a row before we start signing papers. We need to act as one team, a united front." He wasn't saying no, but he wasn't saying yes either. He was saying, "Wait." Again. "Papa, I've been here for 10 years, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I pulled us out of the red. I managed the staff, the suppliers, the marketing, everything. The restaurant is profitable. The conditions have been met. When can we call the lawyer?" He stood up and walked around the desk, placing his hands on my shoulders. It was a gesture of affection, but it felt like a cage. "Patience, my sweet girl. Don't be in such a hurry. Let your brother get settled. Let's hear all his ideas. We will do everything, all in good time." He genuinely believed it. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't lying to me. He was just telling his own version of the truth, a version where my contributions were a given, but my brother's potential was the prize. He gave my shoulder a final squeeze and left the office, leaving me with the ghost of a promise and the cold, hard reality that good time might never come. Have you ever walked into a room and known, with absolute certainty, that your fate was decided long before you arrived? That's how it felt on that Monday morning. The restaurant was unnaturally quiet, stripped of its nightly chaos. The air smelled of bleach and old lemons instead of garlic and simmering tomatoes. The chairs were stacked on the tables like skeletons, and the morning light streaming through the front windows cast long, empty shadows across the floor. It felt less like our restaurant, and more like a stage, set for an execution. My father had called it a family business meeting, positioning us at his favorite corner table, the one with the slightly worn velvet on the booth. He sat at the head, radiating a solemn, paternal authority. Leo was beside him, looking sharp in a tailored blazer, already sketching something on a napkin. He had the restless energy of a racehorse at the starting gate. I sat opposite them, a silent spectator, my hands cold in my lap. The false hope I'd clung to after my talk with Dad had been steadily eroding all weekend, replaced by a familiar, heavy sense of dread. I have been thinking a lot these past few days, my father began, his voice echoing in the empty hall. He folded his hands on the table, a gesture of finality. This restaurant is my life. I built it from nothing. But a man must know when it's time to pass the torch. It is time for a new generation, with new energy and new ideas, to take the lead. He looked at Leo, and his face was illuminated with a kind of blinding pride. He then turned to me, and his expression was one of deep, genuine affection. You two are my legacy, Leo with his brilliant education and Amelia with her heart and her incredible hard work. Together, you are the perfect team. My own heart hammered against my ribs. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe this was it. Maybe perfect team meant what I'd always dreamed it meant. He took a deep breath, puffing out his chest. I am ready to step away from the day-to-day operations. I am officially retiring. So, I have made a decision on the new leadership structure. The silence was absolute. I could hear the buzz of the neon sign outside. Leo put down his pen, his face a mask of eager anticipation. My father beamed at him. Leo, with your vision and our family name, you will be the new president of Russo Enterprises. The words hung in the air. Leo nodded once. A slow, gratified acceptance of what he had always believed was his birthright. Then, my father turned his warm, proud gaze to me. For a split second, the world held its breath. And Amelia, he said, his voice softening, you will be the most important part of his success. You will be his right hand, our vice president of operations. He smiled, a wide beatific smile, as if he had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. He actually expected me to be grateful. Time seemed to warp, the sound in the room fading to a dull roar in my ears. Vice President of Operations. It sounded important, a respectable title for a business card. But it was the three words that came before it that defined its true meaning. His right hand. I wasn't a leader. I was an accessory. I wasn't the strategist. I was the person who would make sure his strategies didn't bankrupt us. The promise of partnership was a lie I had told myself. I looked from my father's beaming face to my brother's smug, satisfied smile. It wasn't just a slap in the face. It was the confirmation of a truth I had spent 10 years trying to ignore. In their eyes, I was just the help. What is the sound of a 10-year-long promise turning to dust? It's not a loud explosion. It's the deafening silence that follows a single, devastating sentence. The words, his right hand, echoed in the empty restaurant, stripping the air of oxygen. My father and brother were still smiling, waiting for me to smile too. To thank them for the pretty, empty title they had bestowed upon me. But my face was frozen, a mask of disbelief. The shock was a physical thing, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. I finally found my voice, but it was a stranger's, thin and sharp. No. The word was small, but it landed on the table between us like a grenade. Leo's smile faltered. My father's brow furrowed in confusion. No? What do you mean, no? He asked, as if I'd just refused a glass of water. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly. No, I don't accept. Vice President of Operations? A glorified assistant? Is that what you think my last decade has been worth? The volume of my voice was rising with every word, the carefully constructed dam of my composure beginning to crack. Amelia, don't be so emotional, Leo said, waving a dismissive hand. It was like pouring gasoline on a flame. Emotional? I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Let me tell you about emotional Leo. Emotional is working 70-hour weeks for 3 years straight to pull this restaurant out of the debt your visionary ideas from college created. Emotional is missing my best friend's wedding because our walk-in freezer died on a Saturday in August. I have poured my life into these 4 walls. I've negotiated with suppliers, trained every single member of our staff, and implemented systems you don't even understand. The argument erupted. It was no longer a conversation but a shouting match, our angry words bouncing off the bare walls. I turned to my father, my voice cracking with a pain so deep it felt ancient. You promised me, Papa. You looked me in the eye and you promised that when this place was a success, I would be your partner. Not his assistant. Your partner. He was on his feet now, his face flushed. I gave you a career. I gave you everything. You are ungrateful, he yelled, pointing a finger at me. He was cornered, his usual charm replaced by raw, defensive anger. He was a king whose authority had been questioned for the first time. That's when he said it. The words that would change everything. The truth he had kept hidden behind 1,000 pats on the head and 1,000,000 declarations of love. He was panting, his eyes wild. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He was trying to make me understand, to put me back in the box he had built for me. Amy, listen to me. You must understand. Leo is a man. He will carry the Russo name forward. He will have a family. This will be his to lead. And you are a wonderful helper. Your greatest talent is to support. This isn't an insult, Amy, it's a compliment. The shouting stopped. The air went still. A compliment. The world tilted on its axis and then snapped back into a focus so sharp and brutal it made my eyes water. It had never been about my skills. It was never about the debt, the long hours, or the profit margins. All my work, all my sacrifices, had been measured on a different scale entirely, one I didn't even know existed. He wasn't seeing a capable, proven leader. He was seeing a daughter, a woman, a helper. And in that one devastating moment of clarity, every illusion I ever had about my place in this family, in this restaurant, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. How long does it take for a place you love to become unrecognizable? In our case, it took less than 1 week. After the explosive confrontation, a fragile, unspoken truce settled over the restaurant. I still came to work. I still managed the floor, but the soul had been carved out of my position. I was a ghost going through the motions, my title of Vice President of Operations a bitter joke. The real power now resided with Leo, the new president, and he wasted no time in making his mark. His reign of progress began. His first official act wasn't to meet with Luca about the menu or to review our supplier contracts. It was to install a mixology station at the bar, a sleek chrome monstrosity complete with smoke guns, sous vide machines for infusions, and a collection of artisanal bitters that cost more than our monthly linen service. "We're elevating the beverage program," he announced proudly. Our most popular drink was a Negroni. Our customers were not clamoring for lavender-infused gin foam. When I pointed out that the $2,000 expenditure could have been used to fix the temperamental dishwasher, he just smiled patronizingly. "Amy, you're thinking operations. I'm thinking brand." The very next day, a large box arrived. Inside were the new uniforms. Our old ones were practical. Black pants, comfortable shoes, and crisp white shirts with an embroidered Russo's on the collar. The new ones looked like they were designed for a nightclub in Milan. The shirts for the men were tight-fitting, and for the women, They were made of a silky synthetic material that was both restrictive and transparent under the dining room lights. The worst part was the aprons. Stylish, half-length leatherette things that offered zero protection. Maria, our young waitress, looked at me with panicked eyes, her arms crossed over her chest. I had no answer for her. I was as powerless as she was. With the brand elevated and the staff stylishly attired, Leo turned his attention to efficiency. He called a staff meeting and unveiled a whiteboard covered in charts. He introduced the concept of key performance indicators, KPIs. Each server would now be judged on their average check size and their upsell rate on desserts and expensive wines. The highest performer at the end of the month would get a $100 bonus. I watched the faces of my team, a team I had painstakingly built on a foundation of collaboration and mutual support. I saw the camaraderie curdle into suspicion in real time. Suddenly, Maria wasn't a teammate to be helped. She was a competitor for that bonus. I couldn't stay silent any longer. That evening, I cornered Leo and my father in the office. I tried to be calm, to be logical. Leo, you're creating a toxic environment. We've always worked as a team. This KPI system, it's going to pit everyone against each other. The service will suffer, not improve. Leo just leaned back in his chair, the one that used to be mine, and steepled his fingers. It's called incentivizing excellence, Amelia. It's basic business. I turned to my father, my last hope. Papa, please. You know this isn't who we are. He just sighed, looking weary. Amelia, your brother has the education. He knows the modern way of doing things. You just need to stop resisting progress and get on board. Resisting progress. The phrase hung in the air, a final damning verdict. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't a leader. I wasn't even a valued employee. I was an obstacle, an old-fashioned relic standing in the way of a brilliant modern future. I walked out of the office and onto the dining room floor. The new cocktail station gleamed under the lights, unused. A busboy struggled to pick up a dropped fork, his movements stiff in the new uniform. And at a corner table, I saw two of our best waiters subtly competing to take an order from a wealthy-looking couple. I wasn't watching progress. I was watching the slow, methodical destruction of everything I had ever built. When do you know it's truly over? It's not during the shouting match. It's in the quiet aftermath, when you find yourself sitting on an overturned milk crate in a back alley that smells of stale beer and old grease, and you feel more at home there than in the dining room you've given your life to. I was tracing the cracks in the pavement with the toe of my shoe, the sounds from the kitchen, the clang of pots, the muffled orders, sounding like they were coming from another world. I had become a stranger in my own life, and the exhaustion was so profound it felt like a physical illness. The back door creaked open, and Lucas stood there, silhouetted against the kitchen's harsh light. At 58, he was a man carved from the same stone as the old country, his face a testament to hot kitchens and long hours. He had been my father's friend since before I was born. He wiped his hands on his white apron, his movements slow and deliberate, and came to stand beside me. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at the brick wall opposite us. "This is not your place, Amelia," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "Out here, in the garbage." I couldn't even summon the energy to disagree. "It feels like it is," I whispered. He shook his head, a small, firm gesture. "I have worked in this kitchen for 30 years. I saw you as a little girl, stealing olives from the prep station. I saw you as a teenager, doing your homework at the corner table. And I saw you come back from college and save this place when your father's heart was bigger than his business sense." He paused, his gaze still fixed on the wall. "He doesn't remember that, but I do. The staff, they remember." He finally turned to look at me, his dark eyes holding a lifetime of wisdom and a fierce, protective loyalty that I hadn't realized was directed at me. "Your father built the walls of this restaurant, it's true," he said, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. "But you are the one who grew the garden inside. You cultivated the staff, you nurtured the customers, you made it a place people wanted to return to. This restaurant, the soul of it, that is you. It is not your father's memories or your brother's stupid ideas. It is you." Each word was a drop of water on parched earth. I felt tears I didn't know I had in me welling up in my eyes, hot and sharp. He wasn't finished. He took a small step closer and his voice dropped even lower, a solemn vow in the grimy alleyway. "I will not stand by and watch that boy burn your garden to the ground. So, I tell you this, Amelia. If you decide to leave this place, I leave with you." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a validation of my work. It was a declaration of allegiance. It was the single most profound gesture of respect I had ever received. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The cold, heavy despair began to recede, replaced by a tiny, flickering flame. He saw my value. The staff saw my value. My loyalty, I realized, had been misplaced. I had been loyal to the bricks and mortar, to a family name, to a man who saw me as a helper. But my loyalty should have been to myself, and to the people who truly saw what I had built. I looked at Luca, at this good and honorable man willing to risk everything for me, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a leader. What does it look like to plan a revolution from inside the castle walls? It looks like smiles that don't reach your eyes and nods of agreement to ideas that make your skin crawl. After Luca's pledge in the alley, my world split into two. There was the Amelia who showed up to work, the vice president of operations who calmly discussed the merits of a new, ridiculously overpriced espresso machine with her brother. And then, there was the real Amelia, who operated in the shadows of my own life, using stolen moments to plot my escape. My first act of treason was a 2-hour lunch break, something I hadn't taken in a decade. I went to see a lawyer, a man in a crisp suit whose office on the 22nd floor was sterile and silent. I explained the situation. 10 years of work, verbal promises of partnership, no written contract. He listened patiently, making a few notes. His verdict was swift and brutal. "Without a contract, Miss Russo, you're an at-will employee. Morally, you may have a case. Legally, you have very little. Your father can structure his company however he sees fit." The cold, hard truth of it left me numb. I had built a career on a foundation of love and trust, and in the eyes of the law, that was the same as building it on sand. That night, in my small apartment, I faced the second reality: my finances. For a decade, my salary had been modest, with the understanding that I was building sweat equity in a business I would one day co-own. I had poured most of my savings back into the restaurant during a lean year to cover payroll. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at my life savings, printed on a flimsy piece of paper from the bank. $9,462. It was a pathetic sum, an insult to a decade of my life. It wasn't enough to start a business. It was barely enough to survive for a few months. The risk wasn't just huge, it felt insurmountable. But despair is a luxury I couldn't afford. Fueled by coffee and a simmering rage, I began to fight back with the only weapons I had: my knowledge and my work ethic. Every night, after my father and brother had gone home, I stayed late at the restaurant, using the office computer not to order linens, but to wage my secret war. I dove into market research, analyzing demographic shifts, neighborhood growth, and commercial real estate listings. I wasn't looking for a prime location in Center City. I was looking for a forgotten corner, a place with potential that bigger players had overlooked. And then I found it. A small, grimy-looking former bakery on a corner lot in the Ironworks district, a neighborhood slowly being colonized by artists and young couples priced out of other areas. It was a gamble. The area was still more grit than glamour. The listing had only 2 blurry photos and a brief description. Great visibility, needs TLC. One rainy afternoon, I drove out to see it. It was even sadder in person, with a faded awning and soap-streaked windows. But I saw what the camera didn't. I saw the new condo building going up 2 blocks away. I saw the bus stop right on the corner. And through the dirty glass, I saw a small, square room with good bones, just waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Hope, sharp and terrifying, pierced through the despair. It was a terrible, reckless, impossible idea. And it was the first thing in years that felt truly mine. How do you hide an earthquake happening inside of you? You learn to walk very, very still. My days at the restaurant became a masterclass in performance. I smiled, I agreed, I offered operational advice on Leo's harebrained schemes, all while my real life was happening in hushed phone calls and frantic late-night searches on the office computer. But my newfound compliance was more unsettling to my brother than my old resistance had ever been. He was used to my arguments, my pushback. My silence was a language he didn't understand, and it made him nervous. He started watching me. It was subtle at first. A glance held a second too long, a casual question about why I was late coming back from lunch. He'd forget something in the office and walk in while I was on the phone, forcing me to abruptly end the call. The restaurant, my home for my entire adult life, began to feel like occupied territory. I was a spy, and he was the suspicious guard, sniffing the air for the scent of treason. I had always known my brother was ambitious, but I was now discovering a new, uglier layer to his character. A deep-seated paranoia that anyone else's success must somehow diminish his own. The discovery, when it came, was born of his own incompetence. One evening, he was trying to reorder wine and couldn't remember the password for one of our supplier accounts. He called me, frustrated, and I told him to check the browser's saved password list on the office computer. It was a careless mistake on my part, a moment of autopilot in a life that now required constant vigilance. I didn't think about the other things that computer held. I didn't think about the breadcrumb trail of my secret life, left right there in the open. I was at home, trying to calculate how many tables I could fit into a 200-square-foot space, when my phone rang. It was my father. His voice was unnervingly calm. "Amelia, I need you to come to the restaurant, now." I walked into a tribunal. They were both there, in the dimly lit office, the door closed. Leo was pacing by the window, unable to look at me. My father was sitting behind the desk, his hands steepled. He looked older, his face etched with a profound and weary sadness. On the screen of the computer, which was angled towards me, was an open email chain. The subject line read, "Re-commercial lease proposal for Ironworks property." My stomach plunged. It wasn't just an accusation, it was an invasion. He had gone through my things, my private plans, and laid them out like evidence at a crime scene. Leo was looking for a password, my father began, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. It was flat, cold, and heavy with judgment. "He found your project." He gestured vaguely at the screen. I opened my mouth to explain, to defend myself, but he held up a hand, silencing me before I could even begin. "I always knew you were envious of your brother. I thought it was natural. He got to go away to school, to see the world. You were here, working. I thought you would be proud of him, support him. But this?" He shook his head slowly, a look of glacial disappointment in his eyes. He didn't scream. It would have been better if he had. Instead, he spoke with the quiet, devastating finality of a judge delivering a life sentence. I thought you had more character, but to plot behind our backs? To try and build something to compete with us, to sabotage your own brother just as he is getting started? It's not just envy, Amelia. It's poison. I was wrong about you. I truly was. In his narrative, my dream wasn't a dream. It was a weapon aimed at my brother's heart. I wasn't building a future, I was committing an act of war. And in that cold, quiet office, I finally understood. I wasn't just the undervalued daughter anymore. I was the enemy. Have you ever reached a point where the only possible move left on the board is to knock the whole thing over? After being branded a traitor, I felt a strange and profound peace settle over me. The war was over because I was no longer fighting. I spent my next scheduled day off, a Wednesday, not planning my next move in secret, but preparing for my final one in the open. I typed a single sentence on a piece of paper, folded it neatly, and put it in my purse next to the heavy ring of restaurant keys. I walked into Russo's trattoria around 3 in the afternoon. The lull between lunch and dinner service was my favorite time of day, a moment of quiet anticipation. But it felt different now, like I was seeing it through a stranger's eyes. My father and Leo were at their usual corner table, a flurry of papers spread between them. Blueprints for a renovation I knew nothing about. They looked up as I approached, their expressions a mixture of surprise and suspicion. My presence here, on my day off, was an anomaly. I didn't offer a greeting. I walked directly to the table and, without a word, pulled the keys from my purse. I placed them on the dark wood, and the metallic clatter was the loudest sound in the silent restaurant. Next to them, I placed the folded letter. My hands were perfectly steady. The frantic, desperate woman from that last confrontation in the office was gone. In her place was someone I was only just beginning to know. I looked directly at my father, whose face was a mask of confusion. "I'm leaving," I said. My voice was calm, even, and utterly final. Leo was the first to react. A slow, smug smirk spread across his face as he leaned back in his chair. He saw this as a victory, the final petulant surrender of his rival. He thought he had won. My father, however, stared at the keys as if they were a venomous snake. He slowly unfolded the single piece of paper. It read, "I hereby resign my position, effective immediately." His eyes darted from the paper to my face, disbelief warring with a rising panic. "What is this, Amelia? A tantrum? You think you can throw a fit and we'll just give you what you want?" I simply shook my head. "There's nothing I want from you anymore." I turned to go, the single most difficult and liberating step I had ever taken. That was what finally broke him. The sight of me walking away, of my back turned to him, shattered his composure. "You can't!" he yelled, his voice cracking, the sound raw and desperate. He scrambled to his feet. "You think you can just walk out? After everything I've given you? You're nothing without this name. Nothing." His words were meant to be a curse, a final crippling blow to anchor me in my place with fear. I stopped at the door, my hand on the cool brass handle. But I didn't turn around. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing my face. His version of my story would end here. A new one was about to begin. "We'll see," I said to the empty space in front of me. And then I walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving the sound of his shouting and the entire world I had ever known behind me. What is the true measure of a person's value? Is it found in their presence, or in the size of the hole they leave behind? The day after I walked out of Rousseau's, a hollow silence filled my small apartment. It was the first Thursday in 10 years that I hadn't been at the restaurant for the morning prep. The air thick with the smell of brewing coffee and baking bread. I felt unmoored, a ghost in my own life, suspended between a past that no longer existed and a future that was nothing more than a terrifying blank page. I expected to feel relief, but all I felt was the phantom limb of a life I had just amputated. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table around 8 in the morning. I flinched, expecting an angry call from my father or a desperate one from my mother. But it was a text from Maria, our youngest waitress. It read, "Amelia, Luca is not here. He's not answering his phone. Leo is having a full-blown meltdown. He's asking where the backup prep lists are." A jolt, sharp and electric, went through me. Of course Luca wasn't there. He had made a promise. And the backup prep lists? They existed only in my head, a complex mental flowchart I had never bothered to write down. I stared at the message, a bitter, complicated feeling churning in my gut. It was happening. An hour later, another text arrived. Then another. Maria was my unwilling war correspondent, sending dispatches from the front line of the collapse. Paolo and Rico just gave Leo their notice. Effective immediately. They said they only stayed for you and Luca, my two best sous chefs, the ones I'd trained myself, who could run the line with their eyes closed. A few minutes later, Sal just packed up his bar tools and walked out. He told Leo to read a book when he was asked how to make a proper old-fashioned. Sal, our bartender for 15 years, a man who could tell a customer's life story from their drink order. I sank into a chair, the phone heavy in my hand. It wasn't a resignation. It was an exodus. A dark, guilty part of me expected to feel a surge of triumph, a vindictive, "I told you so." But it never came. Instead, a profound sadness washed over me. I pictured the kitchen, my kitchen, in a state of utter chaos. I saw Leo, armed with his MBA and his arrogance, trying to direct a skeleton crew of terrified newcomers through the intricate dance of a dinner service. I thought of the loyal customers who would show up expecting the familiar comfort of Russo's, only to be met with confusion and incompetence. I wasn't watching my family get what they deserved. I was watching the slow, painful death of something I had loved. By that weekend, the fallout had gone public. I couldn't stop myself from looking. I scrolled through the local online food forums and review sites, my heart pounding. The first new reviews were trickling in, and they were brutal. "Something is terribly wrong at Russo's," one began. "The service was a disaster and my carbonara was basically scrambled eggs." Another read, "Used to be our go-to spot for special occasions. Last night was a special occasion for all the wrong reasons. The charm is gone." Each word was a small, sharp knife. They weren't just reviewing a restaurant. They were writing the obituary for the decade of my life I had poured into it. Leo, in his panic, tried to plug the holes. He hired cooks from a temp agency who didn't know the recipes. He simplified the menu, cutting the classic dishes that were too complex for his new, inexperienced crew. But he didn't understand. Russo's Trattoria wasn't just a collection of recipes or a business model that could be streamlined. It was a living, breathing thing, a delicate ecosystem of people and relationships I had carefully cultivated over years. I hadn't been a helper or the spine. I had been the center of gravity. And now that I was gone, the whole universe I had held together was simply, quietly, falling apart. There is a strange and brutal poetry to starting over. It tastes like dust and smells like industrial-strength primer. The week after the exodus, my $9,000 savings account took a catastrophic hit. I signed a 1-year lease on the derelict bakery in the Ironworks district, handed over first and last month's rent, and was left with just enough money to keep the lights on and maybe buy a used oven. I stood in the middle of the empty, cavernous space, the silence broken only by the drip of a leaky pipe. This wasn't a restaurant. It was a ruin. The scale of the task ahead was so immense it was almost paralyzing. I wasn't just at the bottom of the mountain. I was in a hole, trying to claw my way to the starting line. But I wasn't alone. The next morning, Luca showed up, holding 2 cups of coffee and a box of donuts. Behind him were Paolo and Rico, my former sous chefs, dressed in paint-splattered jeans and looking ready for a fight. They didn't ask for a salary. They didn't ask for a contract. They just asked where the crowbars were. We became a 4-person army, fueled by cheap coffee and a shared, unspoken fury. We spent the first 3 days just demolishing what was left of the old bakery, tearing out rotten drywall and pulling up layers of cracked linoleum. It was backbreaking, filthy, hellish work. And it was the most joyous I had felt in years. Our days were a blur of manual labor. I spent hours on my laptop, scouring Craigslist and auction sites for used kitchen equipment, haggling over a 6-burner stove with a quirky ignition and a prep table with a slight wobble. Luca, a master chef, became a master carpenter, patiently sanding down salvaged tables we'd found on the curb. We argued over the best way to patch a hole in the plaster. We blasted music from a cheap portable speaker, and every day at noon, we'd stop and eat sandwiches sitting on overturned paint buckets, a fine layer of drywall dust covering everything. Amid the chaos, a new kind of family was being forged, one built not on blood or obligation, but on sweat and loyalty. There were moments of sheer terror, of course, nights when I would lie awake, the aches in my body eclipsed by the gnawing panic in my gut. I was 34 years old, broke, and trying to build a dream on a foundation of scrap metal and blind hope. But then I would remember my father's voice, telling me my greatest talent was to support. And the memory, which once brought me to tears, now felt like a sharpening stone. I wasn't supporting anymore. I was building. Every nail I hammered, every wall I painted was an act of defiance. It was a declaration that I was more than a helper. After 2 solid weeks of 16-hour days, the ruin began to resemble a room. We had painted the walls a warm, creamy white. The mismatched chairs were sanded and stained. The second-hand kitchen, a chaotic puzzle of stainless steel, was assembled and gleaming. On the last night, after the final coat of varnish was dry on the small makeshift bar, we stood together in the quiet space, exhausted and sore, but alive with a feeling that was dangerously close to pride. Luca handed me a small can of black paint and a thin artist's brush. "It's time," he said. I walked to the front window, dipped the brush in the glossy paint, and in the reflection of my own tired, happy face, I began to write. I didn't write Russo. I didn't write Trattoria. With a slow, steady hand, I painted one simple word on the glass. Amelia's. What does happiness sound like? I used to think it was the quiet hum of a perfectly run dining room. Now I know it's the loud, chaotic symphony of my own. 8 months had passed since I'd painted my name on a window. In that time, Amelia's had become the beating heart of the neighborhood. It was too small, always too loud, and our reservations were booked solid for 3 weeks in advance. I worked more hours than I ever had at Russo's, for a fraction of the pay, and I had never, not for a single second, been happier in my entire life. One Tuesday evening during the peak of the dinner rush, the impossible happened. My mother walked in. She stood uncertainly by the door, looking small and out of place amidst the joyful noise of our dining room. She hadn't called, hadn't texted, not once in the 8 months since I'd left. I felt the entire room freeze, though of course, it was only me. I watched her take a seat at the tiny two-top by the window, the one I usually kept open for walk-ins. I sent Maria over, my heart pounding a strange, painful rhythm against my ribs. I watched from the pass as she quietly ordered the cacio e pepe, Luca's simplest, most perfect dish. She ate in silence, her movements slow and deliberate. She never took her eyes off her plate. Halfway through the meal, I saw her shoulders begin to shake. She wasn't sobbing, just crying silently, tears dripping onto the pasta she could no longer eat. She sat like that for a few minutes, then carefully placed her napkin on the table, stood up, and walked out without looking at me. When Maria cleared the table, she found two crisp $100 bills under the plate. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was an admission of guilt. A silent apology written in currency. It was, I knew, the only language she had left. A week later, our wine supplier, a man who had known my family for 20 years, was making a delivery. He lingered after I signed the invoice, looking uncomfortable. "Amy," he started, "I don't know if you've heard." He told me that my father had put Russo's trattoria on the market. The news didn't land like a victory. There was no surge of triumph, no feeling of vindication. There was only a quiet, hollow ache of sadness for the beautiful thing that had been lost, followed by an overwhelming wave of relief. The ghost that had been chasing me my whole life had finally, truly, been laid to rest. That night, I stood at the edge of my noisy, chaotic, beautiful dining room. I watched Luca laughing in the kitchen with Paolo and Rico. I saw Maria expertly explaining the specials to a new table. This was my team. This was my home. This was the family I had built, not from blood, but from loyalty, respect, and shared creation. I looked at the full tables, at the happy faces, at the simple, perfect food being served, and I finally understood. The most important recipe, the one that had taken me 34 years to perfect, had nothing to do with pasta. It was for this. All of this.